If you are new here, you are not just watching another video. You are stepping into a different way of seeing your own behavior. And if you've been here before, you already know this is not entertainment in the usual sense. It is observation. It is pattern recognition. It is the slow rebuilding of how you interpret your impulses, your habits, and the version of you that operates in silence when no one is watching. Before anything continues, enable subtitles. Not for accessibility alone, but because what follows is built on subtle distinctions in meaning. Miss one, and the entire chain of understanding weakens. Now stay with this. You don't have a discipline problem. That sentence alone is where most people would disagree immediately. Because it threatens the only explanation they've been using to understand themselves. Laziness, weakness, lack of motivation. These labels feel familiar, safe, even, but they are incomplete, and anything incomplete becomes dangerous when it is used as a guide. The truth is simpler, and more uncomfortable. The weakest version of you is not lazy. It is trained to seek constant pleasure without resistance. Trained to avoid delay. Trained to treat discomfort as something to escape instead of something to move through. And what makes this dangerous is not the behavior itself, but how normal it starts to feel. Because nothing inside you feels like collapse while it is happening. It feels like preference. It feels like choice. It feels like, just this once. But your brain is not recording intention. It is recording repetition. Every time you choose the easier path when a harder one was available, something silent is updated. Not your identity in words. Your identity in structure, neural preference, behavioral probability, the direction your attention leans without asking permission. And slowly, a version of you begins to form that does not need motivation anymore. Because it has already been conditioned to avoid anything that requires friction. That is where most people misunderstand addiction. They imagine extremes. They think of destruction, chaos, loss of control. But real addiction is often quiet. It does not announce itself. It integrates into daily behavior so smoothly that it begins to feel like personality. Scrolling instead of thinking. Releasing tension instead of holding it. Switching tasks instead of completing them. Consuming instead of creating. Each one small. Each one justified. Each one building the same internal pattern. Escape is safer than effort. And once that becomes the baseline assumption of your nervous system, discipline stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like threat. But here is the part that most people never recognize. The brain does not care whether the reward is meaningful or meaningless. It only cares whether it is immediate. And when immediate reward is available without cost, it begins to outperform everything else in your life that requires patience. Future self loses by default. Not because future self is weak, but because future self does not exist in the nervous system the same way present stimulation does. So what happens next is subtle. You begin to tolerate less effort than you used to. Not consciously, gradually. You stop noticing how quickly you abandon difficult tasks. You stop noticing how often you reach for something easier. You stop noticing the shrinking of your own tolerance for resistance. And because it is gradual, it does not feel like change. It feels like life. There is a point where this becomes identity. Not declared, not chosen, but inferred through repetition. You start to believe you are someone who needs motivation, someone who works better under pressure, someone who just struggles with focus. But none of those are identities. They are outcomes of a system that has been repeatedly rewarded for avoidance. And the most dangerous part is this: the weaker version of you does not feel weak while it is active. It feels correct. It feels efficient. It feels justified. That is why it survives. Not because it is strong, but because it is convincing. There is a psychological mechanism behind this that most people never examine closely enough. The brain does not separate pleasure from safety in the early stages of conditioning. Anything that reduces discomfort quickly becomes associated with relief. And relief, over time, becomes dependency. Not dependency on a substance only. Dependency on avoidance itself. So the system begins to optimize for one thing: escape from effort. And once that optimization is in place, discipline does not feel like improvement. It feels like threat to stability. You try to focus, and something resists it. You try to delay gratification, and something inside pushes back. Not because you are broken, but because your system has already learned a different rule: immediate comfort is the priority. Now pause on that, because if that rule is operating inside you, it explains more of your behavior than you probably want to admit. It explains why you can know what you should do and still not do it. It explains why clarity does not automatically lead to action. It explains why your strongest intentions can dissolve in moments of low resistance. Knowledge was never the missing piece. Conditioning was. And here is where a shift begins, but only if you are willing to see it without softening it. You are not fighting lack of discipline. You are living inside a reward system that has been optimized for short-term relief at the expense of long-term direction. That system does not collapse because you decide it should. It collapses when it is interrupted consistently enough that it can no longer rely on your automatic response. This is where most people fail. They try to destroy the habit instead of interrupting the loop. They argue with the behavior instead of changing the conditions that produce it. And every time they fail, they reinforce the same belief: I cannot control this. But control was never the starting point. Interruption is. Even now, as you process this, there is a part of you that recognizes the pattern. Not as theory, but as recognition. The moments where you chose escape without even thinking. The moments where effort felt heavier than it should have. The moments where comfort made the decision before you did. That recognition is important, because awareness is not transformation, but it is the first place where transformation becomes possible. Now there is something else you need to understand before anything practical matters. The weaker version of you is not an enemy. It is a system that learned survival through avoidance. It learned that discomfort can be reduced instantly. It learned that effort can be postponed indefinitely. And it learned these things through repetition, not intention. Which means it can be unlearned the same way. But not by force, by interruption. And what comes next is not theory. It is structure. But before that structure is introduced, there is a deeper layer you need to see about how identity itself is silently shaped by what you repeatedly allow. Because what you tolerate repeatedly, eventually defines what you believe you are. And most people do not realize how far that process has already gone. Not until they try to change. Not until resistance shows up. Not until the system pushes back. And that is where the real conflict begins. Not between you and addiction, but between you and the version of you that learned to survive through it. If this is already making sense in a way that feels uncomfortably familiar, you are not at the beginning of understanding this. You are at the edge of recognizing it in your own behavior. And what you do with that recognition determines what comes next. There is a point where awareness either becomes action, or fades back into routine. Most people never cross it. They stay aware, and unchanged. But the mechanism behind that choice is what must be understood next. Because nothing about your current state is random. It is structured, and structures can be interrupted. There is a reason the strongest addictions rarely begin with pain. They begin with relief. A small reduction in stress. A quick escape from pressure. A brief moment where the noise inside your head softens just enough for you to breathe again. That is what makes the trap difficult to recognize in the beginning. Because the behavior feels useful before it becomes destructive. And once the brain associates relief with a specific action, repetition starts accelerating quietly beneath awareness. This is how people lose control without realizing they are losing it. Not through one catastrophic decision. Through hundreds of invisible permissions. One more scroll. One more distraction. One more release. One more delay. One more excuse that sounds reasonable enough to survive questioning. The mind is extremely skilled at protecting patterns that provide immediate comfort. It will defend them with logic if necessary. That is why people can explain their own self-destruction with incredible intelligence while continuing the behavior at the same time. And the longer this continues, the more dangerous something else becomes. The shrinking of your resistance threshold. This is the part most people never notice until years have already passed. You were not always this mentally fragile around discomfort. There was a time your attention lasted longer. A time your patience was stronger. A time where boredom did not immediately create panic in your nervous system. A time where silence did not feel unbearable. Now watch carefully what happens when pleasure becomes constant. The brain starts expecting stimulation at all times. Moments that once felt neutral suddenly feel empty. Tasks that once felt manageable begin feeling exhausting. Stillness becomes agitation. Focus becomes friction. And because modern life provides endless escape routes, the brain never has to rebuild tolerance naturally. That matters more than people think. Because tolerance for discomfort is one of the foundations of personal power. Not confidence, not motivation, tolerance. The ability to remain inside effort without immediately reaching for relief. Most people cannot do that anymore. They need noise while eating, entertainment while resting, stimulation while thinking, validation while speaking, distraction while existing. And when the mind loses the ability to sit with discomfort, it becomes vulnerable to anything that promises immediate relief. That is where addiction stops being about the substance or habit itself. It becomes about dependency on interruption. Dependency on not feeling pressure for more than a few moments at a time. You can see this everywhere now. People reaching for their phones before their own thoughts fully form. Switching applications every few seconds. Starting tasks they cannot finish. Watching content while watching other content. Minds splitting into fragments because silence has become psychologically threatening. But what looks normal socially can still be destructive neurologically. The brain adapts to the environment it repeats. If the environment constantly rewards distraction, the brain becomes distractible. If the environment constantly rewards escape, the brain becomes avoidant. If the environment constantly rewards pleasure without effort, the brain stops valuing effort itself. And once effort loses emotional value, discipline begins collapsing from the inside. This is why some people feel tired before they even begin important work. Their nervous system has already learned to associate effort with deprivation instead of meaning. That changes everything, because now the mind is no longer choosing between discipline and pleasure. It is choosing between perceived suffering and perceived relief. And relief wins most of the time. Not because the person lacks potential. Not because they are unintelligent. But because their reward circuitry has been conditioned to prioritize immediate emotional regulation over long-term transformation. There is another layer to this that almost nobody talks about honestly. Pleasure itself is not the problem. The problem is uncontrolled access to pleasure without earned resistance. Because when rewards arrive too easily and too frequently, the nervous system loses sensitivity. Ordinary life begins feeling dull. Effort feels emotionally empty. Progress feels too slow to compete. And this creates a dangerous psychological shift. You begin needing higher stimulation just to feel normal. Not fulfilled. Normal. That is how people drift deeper into compulsive behavior without intending to. The baseline changes. And once your baseline changes, your standards begin changing with it. You stop expecting discipline from yourself consistently. You stop expecting focus. You stop expecting restraint. You stop trusting your own word privately. That last part matters more than most people realize. Because self-respect is built quietly through internal evidence. Not public image. Not appearance. Evidence. Every promise you keep to yourself strengthens identity. Every promise repeatedly broken weakens it. And eventually the mind notices the pattern. You say you will stop. You continue. You say tomorrow will be different. It repeats again. After enough repetition, something dangerous forms underneath the behavior. Distrust. Not toward other people, toward yourself. This is why addiction often creates emotional numbness over time. Because the mind becomes exhausted by contradiction. It stops fully believing its own intentions. Goals become fantasies instead of commitments. Ambition becomes entertainment instead of direction. And people wonder why motivation disappears. Motivation disappears when identity no longer trusts action. That is why temporary emotional hype never solves this problem. A strong speech cannot override deeply reinforced behavioral conditioning for long. Emotion fades. Systems remain. The real question is not whether you feel inspired today. The real question is what your nervous system has been trained to expect when discomfort arrives. Because that expectation determines behavior before conscious thought even enters the room. Now here is where this becomes personal. You already know your patterns. You know the exact moments where resistance collapses. The exact environments where discipline weakens. The exact emotional states that trigger escape behavior. Most people pretend not to see these patterns because seeing them creates responsibility. But denial changes nothing. Your habits are telling the truth about your conditioning every day whether you admit it or not. That is why awareness without action becomes painful eventually. Because once you clearly see the loop, continuing it creates internal conflict. You begin feeling the split between who you could become and what you repeatedly reinforce instead. And that split creates a specific kind of suffering. Quiet disappointment, not dramatic failure, not visible collapse, just the slow realization that your potential is being negotiated away in small daily transactions with comfort. Most people never say this out loud, but they feel it constantly. Especially at night, especially in silence, especially after another day disappeared into impulses that promised relief and delivered emptiness instead. Because pleasure without meaning eventually creates emotional hollowness. The stimulation remains, but the satisfaction weakens. So the brain searches for more stimulation to replace the missing meaning. And the cycle deepens. This is why people trapped in compulsive behavior often feel strangely disconnected from themselves. They are overstimulated but emotionally undernourished. Their attention is consumed, but their identity remains undeveloped. Nothing stable is being built internally. Only temporary regulation. And temporary regulation can never create lasting strength. Strength comes from remaining present when relief is available but intentionally delayed. That is where self-respect begins rebuilding. Not through perfection, through interruption. A single moment where the automatic response is broken. One urge observed without immediate obedience. One discomfort survived without escape. One decision where future self finally wins against present impulse. At first these moments feel small, but the nervous system notices them immediately. Because for the first time in a long time, the pattern changes. And patterns changing is how identity changes. Not instantly, not dramatically, repeatedly. This is why real discipline often looks unimpressive externally in the beginning. No dramatic transformation, no sudden enlightenment, just small acts of resistance repeated long enough that the brain begins learning a different expectation. Discomfort no longer means danger. Delay no longer means suffering. Effort no longer feels unnatural. But most people quit before this adaptation happens. They expect immediate emotional reward for disciplined behavior, and when it does not arrive quickly, they return to familiar stimulation instead. They misunderstand the process completely. Your brain will initially resist the very behaviors that would heal it. Because healing feels unfamiliar at first. Stillness feels uncomfortable. Focus feels difficult. Silence feels loud. Restraint feels empty. But those reactions are not proof you are failing. They are proof your nervous system is adjusting after prolonged overstimulation. That distinction matters, because if you misinterpret resistance as failure, you return to the cycle immediately. And the cycle is patient. It waits for exhaustion, for boredom, for loneliness, for stress, for the moment your awareness weakens just enough for conditioning to take control again. Which is why what comes next matters more than motivation ever will. Because the solution is not emotional intensity. It is environmental and psychological interruption strong enough to weaken the loop itself. And once you understand how that interruption works, something changes permanently in the way you see your impulses. You stop seeing them as commands, and start seeing them as conditioned signals. That is the beginning of real control. There is a moment in every compulsive pattern where the behavior stops feeling like a decision. It starts happening faster than thought. Not because you suddenly lost intelligence, but because repetition has shortened the gap between urge and action so aggressively that awareness arrives too late to intervene. That gap is where control used to live, and most people never notice when it closes. They only notice the consequences afterward. The missing time, the unfinished tasks, the fatigue that feels unjustified, the quiet sense that the day moved without them inside it. But the real change happened earlier. In milliseconds. Before reflection. Before reasoning. Before intention could even form. This is what conditioning does when it becomes strong enough. It removes negotiation. So now, instead of, should I do this? The system produces a direct action. No pause. No internal debate. Just impulse followed by execution. And the more often this loop completes, the more natural it becomes. Until one day, discipline feels like something external. Something you try to apply, instead of something your system already supports. That is a reversal of identity architecture. Because originally, you were designed to respond to choice. Now you are responding to pattern. And patterns do not care about your long-term goals. They care about repetition history. This is where the concept of the weakest version of you becomes clearer. It is not a separate person. It is a collection of reinforced responses that activate under specific conditions. Certain emotions, certain times of day, certain environments, certain levels of stress or boredom. You do not become that version randomly. You enter it through triggers. And each trigger is learned. Which means each trigger can also be unlearned. But that requires something most people avoid. Awareness during the moment of activation. Not after, not before, during. Because the system only changes when interruption happens inside the loop, not outside it. This is why advice alone rarely works. Knowing what is happening does not stop it from happening. The body still executes the trained sequence unless something breaks the chain in real time. And breaking that chain feels unnatural at first. Because the urge does not feel like a suggestion. It feels like necessity, a pressure building inside the nervous system that demands resolution. The brain interprets it as urgency. But urgency is often just prediction error. A learned expectation that certain discomfort must be resolved immediately. Not because it is dangerous. Because it is familiar. That distinction is critical. Because it exposes something most people never question. You are not reacting to reality. You are reacting to expectation. And expectations are built from repetition, not truth. This is why two people can experience the same moment and behave completely differently. One has trained tolerance. The other has trained escape. Same environment, different conditioning history, and their nervous systems respond accordingly. So when someone says, "I can't control it," what they often mean is something more precise. I have not built interruption capacity inside this specific loop. That is fixable, but not through motivation spikes or emotional decisions made at peak clarity. Those moments are unreliable, because the real challenge is not deciding to change when you feel strong. It is interrupting the pattern when you feel weak. When the urge is active. When attention is narrowed. When rationalization is already forming. That is the real training ground. Not theory. Activation states. Now consider something important. Most addictive behaviors are not actually driven by desire alone. They are driven by state shifts. Stress, fatigue, boredom, isolation, mental overload. In those states, the brain reduces long-term processing and increases immediate relief seeking. So the weaker version of you is not always active. It is state-dependent, which means control is not about becoming permanently strong. It is about learning how to behave differently inside weak states. That is a completely different skill. One that most people never train. They only try to be disciplined in ideal conditions. Then collapse in real ones. And repeat the cycle. This is why progress often feels inconsistent for so many people. They assume inconsistency means failure of identity. But it is actually a failure of state preparation. The system is not stable across conditions yet. So when pressure rises, the default conditioning takes over. And the default is always the most repeated behavior. Now here is where a shift begins to take shape. If behavior is state dependent, then change must also be state aware. You cannot rely on intention alone. You must design interruption into the environment, not just the mind. Because the environment triggers the state. The state triggers the impulse. The impulse triggers the behavior. And the behavior reinforces the identity. That is the full loop. Which means if you want to change identity, you cannot start at identity. You start at interruption. This is where practical control actually begins. Not in saying no, but in creating friction between impulse and action. Even a small delay changes the outcome more than most people expect. Because urges rise and fall like waves. They peak. Then they decay. If you do not immediately act on them, they weaken naturally. But if you obey instantly, you train immediacy. So control is not suppression. It is timing. And timing is trainable. There is another layer here that most people ignore because it feels uncomfortable. Your brain is constantly trying to conserve energy. So it will always prefer the path that requires the least cognitive resistance in the moment. This is not moral weakness. It is efficiency programming, which means the brain will choose familiar reward pathways even when they are destructive, simply because they require less effort than building new ones. So when someone says, "Why do I keep doing this even though I know it's bad?" the answer is not confusion. It is efficiency. The system is doing what it has been trained to do most easily. Which means change will initially feel like resistance against your own system. Because you are not just stopping a behavior. You are overriding efficiency. That is why discipline feels heavy at first. Not because it is wrong, but because it is new. And anything new requires more energy until it becomes familiar. Now pause on that idea, because it explains why most people never sustain change. They interpret early resistance as proof they are not capable, when in reality it is proof the system is being rewritten. But instead of continuing through that phase, they return to what feels easy. And easy is just another word for well-trained. So the cycle resets, and identity remains unchanged. But there is a specific point where this pattern begins to weaken. It is not when urges disappear. It is when urges are observed without immediate obedience. That moment creates a split in the loop. And every split weakens the automatic response. At first it feels insignificant, almost too small to matter. But the nervous system is sensitive to repetition, not intensity. Which means small interruptions repeated consistently will eventually outweigh strong impulses obeyed repeatedly. This is the part most people underestimate. They think transformation requires dramatic action. But real transformation is structural. And structure changes through repetition under resistance, not inspiration. Now here is something that may feel uncomfortable but necessary to recognize. If you repeatedly lose control in specific moments, it is not because those moments are uniquely powerful. It is because those moments are untrained. They have no alternative behavior built into them yet, so they default to the strongest existing pattern, which is usually escape. But that is not permanent. It is current state, and current state is always adjustable. The question is whether you are willing to stay present long enough inside discomfort to let a different response form. Because that is where change actually happens. Not in deciding, but in staying. And most people never reach that stage consistently enough for the brain to rewrite the loop. So they remain observers of their own patterns instead of authors of them. But observation alone is already a shift. Because once you see the structure clearly, it stops feeling like identity. It starts feeling like mechanism. And mechanisms can be interrupted. Which brings you to the next layer. Because once interruption becomes possible, the entire system begins to reorganize around that new possibility. And what comes after that is not struggle in the same way anymore. It is reconstruction. At a certain point, you stop asking why the behavior exists. Because the answer becomes obvious. It exists because it works in the short term. Not in the long term. Not in the meaningful sense. But in the immediate psychological sense where discomfort is reduced fast enough for the nervous system to register relief. That is the real currency being exchanged. Not pleasure. Relief. And relief is powerful enough to override intention almost every time it appears without interruption. This is where most people misunderstand themselves. They think they are choosing pleasure. In reality, they are escaping pressure. The difference matters, because if you mislabel the mechanism, you try to fight the wrong thing. You try to remove desire when the real driver is avoidance of discomfort. And discomfort is not removed by reasoning. It is navigated. This is why discipline often fails when it is treated as a constant state instead of a situational skill. No one is equally capable in every emotional condition. The nervous system shifts, attention narrows, impulse strength changes, so the real question is not whether you are disciplined. The real question is what happens to you when discomfort enters the system. Because that is the activation point of the weakest version of you. Not all the time, only under specific internal conditions. That is why people often feel confused by their own inconsistency. They experience moments of clarity where everything makes sense, followed by moments where none of that clarity seems accessible anymore. It feels like two different versions of the same mind. But it is not two minds. It is one system operating under different states. And state determines behavior more than belief. That is a critical correction most self-improvement thinking misses. Belief is often assumed to be the driver of action. But belief without state alignment is fragile. It collapses under stress. In contrast, trained behavior survives even without motivation. Which means the real foundation of change is not insight. It is repetition inside resistance states. Now consider what happens when someone begins to interrupt a compulsive loop even slightly. At first, nothing feels different. The urge still appears. The tension still rises. The familiar pull still activates. But there is a gap introduced between impulse and action, even if it is only a few seconds. That gap is not empty. It is where awareness enters. And awareness changes the trajectory of automatic behavior. Because the system is no longer fully closed, there is interference. At first, the interference is weak. The urge still wins most of the time. But something subtle begins to shift in the background. The brain starts learning uncertainty. It no longer predicts immediate obedience. And prediction uncertainty weakens habit strength over time. This is how loops start to destabilize. Not through force, through inconsistency of response, but not random inconsistency, intentional interruption. Because if interruption is repeated enough times, the loop stops being reliable. And once a loop becomes unreliable, it loses authority. This is where identity begins to shift at a deeper level. Not through self-image, but through reduced automaticity. You are no longer purely reactive in certain moments. And that creates space for choice to return. But choice returning is not always comfortable. Because it reintroduces responsibility inside moments that previously felt automatic. And responsibility feels heavier than escape at first. So there is resistance to even becoming aware. This is why many people avoid reflection. Not because they lack intelligence, but because awareness increases friction before it increases control. It exposes the gap between what they say they want and what they repeatedly do. And that gap is uncomfortable to sit with. So the mind prefers distraction. But distraction only delays confrontation with the same pattern. It does not resolve it. Now here is where a more precise understanding becomes necessary. Every compulsive system has three components: trigger, response, reward. Most people try to change the response directly. But if the trigger remains identical and the reward remains immediate, the system will attempt to restore the original response automatically. That is why relapse happens even after strong decisions. Because the environment still produces the same internal conditions. So real change requires structural adjustment, not just behavioral effort. Trigger interruption, reward delay, response replacement. But even more important than technique is timing. Because the nervous system does not learn from intention. It learns from outcomes repeated under similar conditions. Which means change must happen inside the exact context where failure used to occur. Not in ideal conditions, in real activation states. This is where discipline becomes a skill rather than a personality trait. And once it is treated as a skill, it becomes trainable. But training requires repetition under discomfort, not avoidance of it. This is where most people unintentionally sabotage themselves. They try to eliminate discomfort entirely before attempting discipline. But discomfort is not a signal to stop. It is the condition where control is built. If you remove discomfort completely, you remove the training environment. And without training conditions, nothing adapts. So the goal is not to feel ready. The goal is to remain present while not ready. That is where rewiring occurs. And over time, something begins to change quietly. The urgency of impulses decreases. Not because they disappear, but because they lose automatic authority. They become signals instead of commands. And that shift alone changes behavior significantly. Because once an impulse is no longer treated as an order, it becomes optional. And once something becomes optional, choice returns. Now there is another layer that becomes visible only after enough repetition has occurred. The mind begins to trust your actions more than your intentions. This is where identity stabilizes again. Not through affirmation, but through evidence. Every time you interrupt a pattern successfully, you generate internal proof that the system can behave differently under pressure. And that proof accumulates, slowly, quietly, without dramatic emotional reinforcement, but it accumulates nonetheless. And eventually, a threshold is crossed where the weaker version of you is no longer the default response. It still exists, but it is no longer automatic. It requires less force to resist it. And more importantly, it becomes less convincing. Because it loses consistency. This is the point where many people experience confusion. They expect transformation to feel like elimination of struggle. But what actually happens is redistribution of control. The urge still appears, but obedience decreases, and that gap becomes the new space of identity formation. You are no longer defined by the presence of impulse, but by your response to it. And that is where real self-mastery begins. Not in removing weakness, but in no longer obeying it instantly. At this stage, something important becomes clear. You were never lacking awareness. You were lacking interruption at the moment it mattered. And once that interruption is trained, the entire system begins to reorganize around it. But even then, the process is not complete. Because rebuilding identity is not only about stopping old behavior. It is about establishing new internal expectations that replace it. And that is where the next shift begins.